in that same poll that shows a tied race with
And
Donald
let me
Trump.
get David Axelrod to weigh in specifically on that point.
Yeah,
among people, David, as you know, and we just heard from our other David, that they'll vote for Biden in November. 54% of them, these are 54%, that's a majority, say he should step aside. These are his own supporters. Can he just ignore that?
Well, I don't think he can, Wolf, but, you asked a question earlier about whether Democrats were divided. I think that there's one thing on which they're not divided, and that is the fervent desire to defeat President Trump, because everybody, as David suggests, shares the concerns that President Biden has expressed about Trump's illiberal, anti-democratic tendencies, and they're worried about it. And they think this is an existential election. So I think with all the affection and all the respect for the president, I think the number one priority of most Democrats is to win in November and defeat Donald Trump. The second is to try and elect a Democratic House and maintain a Democratic Senate. That will be hard, which is affected by what happens on the top of the ticket. So, I don't think the party is divided in its ultimate goal, but this is a very, it's an unprecedented and awkward situation that the Democratic Party finds itself in. I think at the end of the day, there'll likely be unity around the goal that has motivated people from the beginning.
Bakari Sellers, I'm anxious to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever been more kind of disappointed at our inability to circle the wagons, at our inability to have these conversations that are not aired publicly on CNN or in Politico or New York Times or Wall Street Journal. I think that we are highlighting one of our greatest faults as Democrats in this country, which is when you have an op-ed piece by George Clooney, for example, but George Clooney's never talked to LaTosha Brown or Cliff Albright. He probably doesn't even know who they are from Black Voters Matter, who are actually doing the real work, the people who are knocking on doors, who are registering voters. And what we're doing is we're highlighting that disconnect within our party, it took someone like Barack Obama to bring those factions together. And whomever, if President Biden is someone who steps aside when Kamala Harris assumes that role, if that's the case, then she may be somebody who can unify that. But my disappointment lies in the inability for us to lead this country at a time where we need to be able to keep our business outside of the tabloids, to want to run to Morning Joe in the morning and sit down across from him and continue to bastardize the president of the United States, to have these disconnects like we saw yesterday from our former leader. I mean, I'm just disappointed from top down. And what we're going to have in between now and then is somebody who comes in and is able to unify this party along that line, because all of us are working towards beating Donald Trump in November, whether or not it's Kamala Harris or Joe Biden.
David, you want to make a point?
I just want to respond to what, yeah, I do. I want to respond to what Bakari said. I mean, the reason that these conversations are in public was because there was no way to have them in private, because the president was cloistered and did not want to hear it, and his aides did not want to hear it. That's why these conversations have tumbled out into public. And they tumbled out into public because it became a kind of break glass situation after the debate. So yes, it'd be nice if everything were neat and orderly, but that's not the circumstances that presented themselves. So you can be disappointed, Bakari. I'm disappointed too. This is a terribly hard situation, but I don't think you can blame the Democratic Party for this situation. I think this situation, has also resulted from the sort of denial from folks in the White House.
I'm not blaming the Democratic Party, and I'm sorry, Wolf, for jumping in. I'm not blaming the Democratic Party, but what I am saying is there are a lot of people who are articulating their views on whether or not Joe Biden should run or not run, who are underestimating and not valuing the fierce urgency that I've talked to voters about. When you go out in the streets and you're talking particularly to black voters, to brown voters, to gay voters, to people who are afraid of the persecution they may face under Donald Trump, the gamesmanship that we're displaying within the Beltway, it doesn't resonate with them, because most of them are saying whether or not it's Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, this is too important. Get your act together. I do not want the chaos. And what we're about to bring on our own party, I'm afraid, is chaos. And hopefully Kamala Harris can soothe that.
I want to bring Shermichael Singleton into this once again and get your thoughts. Shermichael.
I mean, look, Wolf, I think Bakari made a salient point in terms of black voters, Latino voters, members of the LGBTQ community who are probably concerned for a lot of different reasons about where the election could go. And I certainly understand that. But that's not enough for Joe Biden to win the election if he loses a substantial percent of white voters, a substantial percent of suburban voters, those folks in the middle, if they decide to stay home because they have very serious questions about the president's cognitive abilities and overall health. I think the campaign had a matter of days to respond to this. The fact that they waited more than a week raises the question in the minds of people who are skeptical about the president's health. Why did they wait so long? Are they actually worried about the president's ability to stand before a pool of journalists? Are they hiding something from us? That's the worst thing you want for voters to formulate in their minds. And again, if those are the questions that a campaign is wrestling with, as a strategist, I'm a Republican, I'm sort of stepping out of this, watching my Democratic friends try to figure this out. At some point, you have to make the decision, we need to change the captain of this ship because we're not headed in the right direction. And that probably is going to be Vice President Harris.
Shermichael and everyone else, everybody stand by. Just ahead, right here in the Situation Room, we're only moments away from President Biden's first news conference since that debate and the growing calls from members of his own party calling for him to step aside. We're going to bring it to you live. Stand by. We're waiting for President Biden's high-stakes news conference to begin as his re-election bid is in crisis right now. We're going to carry his remarks live. Stand by for that. But right now, I want to check in on what's going on with the Vice President, Kamala Harris, who's out on the campaign trail. CNN's Eva McKend is joining us live from the battleground state of North Carolina. Eva, what's the Vice President's message at this delicate moment of deep uncertainty for the Democrats?
Well, Wolf, the vice president is spending her time crisscrossing the country, making the case to key parts of the Democratic coalition. She was in Nevada speaking to Asian American voters this week. Today, here in Greensboro at historic Black high school, really defending President Biden and trying to steer the conversation back to the threat of former President Donald Trump. Let's listen.
The past few days have been a reminder that running for president of the United States is never easy, nor should it be. But one thing we know about our president, Joe Biden, is that he is a fighter. He is a fighter. And he is the first to say, when you get knocked down, you get back up.
And Wolf, our colleagues over at the New York Times reporting tonight that President Biden's team is polling to see how Harris would fare up against Trump. Not clear why they're doing that, if they're doing that to convince others that Biden is, in fact, the best person to go up against Trump in the fall, or if they are trying to convince Biden to step aside. Wolf.
Eva, I know you've been speaking to voters out there on the campaign trail. How are they responding to Vice President Harris?
You know, Wolf, Harris has had many black voter-focused events. She was at the Essence Festival. She gave the keynote address for her sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha. She also held that black voter-focused event today. And time again, especially from older black voters, I'm hearing them say that they want to stick to the ticket as it is. Younger voters show more of an appetite for Harris to ascend to the top of the ticket, but they're not ready to do so in a fashion that would push President Biden out. They say that he has to arrive at that decision for himself. Wolf. Eva
McKend out there on the campaign trail. Eva, thank you very much. Stand by. Also coming up, we're waiting for President Biden to take reporters' questions at a news conference. We'll be right back.
Aaron Burnett out front, next on CNN.
Anticipation is building for President Biden's news conference tonight in the midst of the crisis embroiling his campaign. As we stand by to hear from the president, I want to bring in CNN's Brian Todd. Brian, a solo news conference like this one that's about to take place is relatively rare for this president.
That's right, Wolf. President Biden has held far fewer of these news conferences than his most immediate predecessors. Tonight will be the president's 37th news conference overall, his 15th solo news conference. That's one with no one else standing beside him. Now compare that to Donald Trump, who by the same point in his presidency had held almost twice as many news conferences. According to data from the University of California at Santa Barbara's American Presidency Project, Trump at this point in his presidency had held 64 news conferences. 16 of them were solo. Now, with Trump's events, though, there is a bit of a caveat. He held many news conferences in the context of a unique situation. Many of Donald Trump's news conferences, like this one, were called to update the public on efforts to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. But President Biden's numbers are still stark compared to his other predecessors. Now, by this time in his presidency, Barack Obama had held 72 news conferences. 32 of those were solo news conferences. George W. Bush, at this time in his presidency, we're talking 3.5 years in, well, he had held 82 news conferences. 15 of those were solo. The recent presidents who held fewer news conferences than Joe Biden at this point in their terms, well, those were two of them. Ronald Reagan with 25, Richard Nixon with 24. Wolf.
Brian Todd, thank you very much. I'm Wolf Blitzer in the Situation Room. Our special coverage of President Biden's news conference continues with Aaron Burnett out front right now.
This is CNN Breaking News.
Good evening, I'm Aaron Burnett, and out front tonight we begin with the breaking news. We are moments away, seconds away from President Biden's high-stakes news conference, a solo news conference, and what is the reality of the situation we are in, a highly consequential moment that could be a turning point for his campaign. Members of Congress, donors, voters, strategists, world leaders, all of them are watching this moment as the President of the United States tries to extinguish growing calls for him to step aside from his re-election campaign. Kayla Tausche is live from the news conference, which, as I said, is just a moment here or two away from beginning. So, Kayla, you are in that room watching these final preparations for the President of the United States to come out for this press conference. What are you learning right now?
Aaron, the room is just starting to fill up as we await the President of the United States. Against this backdrop, we expect him to hail some of the achievements of this particular summit, marking the 75th anniversary of the alliance. But the president is going to have to engage in a high-wire act to try to shore up confidence among members of his own party that he is the candidate that they should unify behind for re-election and to beat Donald Trump. Earlier today, his top advisors held their daily call that they hold at 9 a.m., where they discussed the president's prospects in the race. I'm told as of this morning, there had been no change of heart, according to a senior administration official. They now do that call twice a day since the debate, adding a 9 p.m. call as well to just sift through what's happened during the day and figure out what it means for the next. As of today, we do not expect the president to make any announcement about dropping out. That was at least the word from a senior administration official earlier today. The president has been toggling between the various official events here at the summit, but his aides who briefed him on Capitol Hill, some of them joined him here. And you have to imagine that in those conversations, he got a little bit of a taste of what some Senate Democrats were saying, giving them an earful earlier today. Many of those members telling CNN that it didn't matter what the president said on this stage tonight because what they saw on the debate stage had caused them to make up their mind. Of course, many of those aides, many in the president's inner circle, the very members of his administration and campaign that have sown so much frustration among top Democrats who tell CNN they believe that they were shielded from signs of the president's aging over the last year. Otherwise, they would have been in a position to reconsider or make a different decision on their candidate for 2024 sooner. Now they're in a position where they're having to make this decision in crunch time with just days before the Democratic National Convention. Of course, all eyes are on the president here tonight. We don't know the exact parameters of what we will hear from him, how many questions he plans to take, how long we expect this press conference to go. So certainly we will wait and see and deliver that news to you live, Aaron.
All right. Well, Kayla, stay with me as we await here. Kayla talks about that room filling up, the president going to come out. There's going to be reporters from around the world in that room because this is on the heels of the NATO summit. So obviously, as you can see, the woman there, as they're getting ready, that will be the podium where the president will approach in just a few moments. So Kayla's staying with me. I want to just briefly go to Capitol Hill, though, because Kayla mentions all those members of Congress who have been talking to CNN, many of whom are saying their minds are made up regardless of what they see tonight or at any other point from the president. And Manu Raju was there on Capitol Hill. Manu, you've been speaking to many of these members, getting some new members speaking out to you. What are they saying?
Yeah, look, there are a lot of private concerns about the president that have not come public yet. And we do expect in the aftermath of this press conference, more members to come out and call for Joe Biden to step aside. How many? Unclear. How quickly? Also unclear. Could it be a slow drip as we have seen so far? It certainly could be. But a lot of the members who I've been speaking to have said that they're going to wait until after this press conference to go forward with their concerns. They're all, even though there are 14 members of Congress so far who have been public and who have said that Joe Biden should step aside. And there's 14 Democrats in the House and in the Senate, one Senate Democrat. That is a fraction of the overall number of House Democrats and Senate Democrats. There are many more who harbor deep concerns about the state of the Biden campaign. Some of them hope he makes a decision to ultimately step aside. If he does not do that or does anything in the way of a shaky performance tonight, expect more of them to make their voice public and try to pressure the president to make that decision. But there's also some concern by doing that. It could essentially force the president to dig in. Already the president has plans to campaign next week, and that is the message that they sent behind closed doors to Senate Democrats today when top campaign officials briefed Senate Democrats. They said that the president was going to hit the battleground states. He's going to do a major television interview on Monday and made no indication, I'm told, that he plans to step aside here. So this tension is only going to build after tonight, Aaron, especially if he stumbles in this high-profile moment that could define his presidency and the rest of this campaign. Aaron.
All right, Manu, thank you very much. Manu with me, Kayla with me as we are standing by waiting for the president to approach that podium. We also have our panel with me. And I want to start with you, Kate Bedingfield, because you know the president and you've worked with him and you've spent a lot of time with him. And I'm wondering what you think is going through his mind right now, given the high stakes of this moment. And he knows it. And the pressure and stress that he is under as he walks out to that podium, knowing that every single word he says, or any single word he says, could be used to end his campaign.
Well, certainly. I think he has every understanding that this is a significant high-stakes moment. I imagine as he's preparing, he's working through what are the key things that he wants to show people, that he wants people who are watching this press conference to come away with. And, I think the things he needs to do are, he needs to convey that he shares the belief that this race and the potential threat of a second Donald Trump presidency is an existential threat, that he has the energy and the vigor and the fire to fight that fight. I think that's more than anything. I think what anxious Democrats are going to be looking for tonight as they're watching this, they're certainly going to be, the press is going to be listening to every word and parsing every word. Some viewers will do that too, but I think most viewers will probably just be watching to see if he can bring that level of energy that's necessary to wage the kind of intense campaign that's going to have to happen over the next 4 months. So he should be focused on making sure that he's conveying that. He certainly knows this is a high stakes moment. I have no doubt that he's preparing for it, and we'll see. But there are a lot of eyes on this press conference tonight, and I think there is a lot of concern. We've heard a lot of reporting about concern on the Hill, and I think they'll see tonight, I hope, what they'll see is a really vigorous Joe Biden, but that's the task ahead of him tonight.
And Van, when Kate references those on Capitol Hill watching, Kayla mentioned the number 14 Democrats thus far in Congress have called on Biden to get out. That includes one senator. Politico now says at least 6 more House Republicans are watching tonight, and that this press conference that we're about to see, they have said would be the determinant for them of whether they jump on board that train to push him out. I know, Van, where you stand, that you've said that he needs to step aside. Is there anything that he could do tonight or a performance that you would see that would at this point change your mind?
Sure. I mean, look, first of all, it's not just elected officials that are watching. He's going to walk out there, frankly, on a carpet of prayers. There's a lot of grassroots people who see this very differently than the political professionals like myself. There are a lot of African Americans in particular who feel that Donald Trump is getting a free pass. He can say anything, and it's expected that he's going to say crazy stuff, that Joe Biden's being held to a different standard and it's not fair. And so there's a lot of prayer out there for Biden that you don't see. There's a lot of people who feel, in the Black community, we're used to seeing leaders stumble and be attacked. And so there's a, the grassroots fundraising is going up for him. Phone calls into Black radio stations is going up for him. And so he's walking out there with some support that people may be surprised exists for him. And if he can find himself, if he can find that center, if he can speak from who he really is, I think that might allay some fears. I think the challenge is that we are now in a dynamic where any mistake he makes is a headline, and Donald Trump continues to say crazy stuff and nobody even notices. And that's a tough situation for him to be in tonight.
Yeah, well, it's a fair point, because after this moment, if he gets past it, then there's the next one. I mean, no doubt that's how he feels. Instead, when Van talks about the carpet of prayer, I believe that's the phrase you used, Van, that accompanies Biden tonight with some of his supporters and grassroots supporters. You have spent a lot of time talking to those supporters, to voters. What are they telling you?
Yeah, I think that tonight is going to be a test of whether Biden can do what he hasn't done over the last year and a half, which is speak to the fundamental concern most Americans have about his presidency. It did not take the debate for a lot of Americans to think Biden was too old for a second term. And frankly, the campaign and the candidate have not spoken to those concerns, have ignored the evidence of those concerns consistently over the last year and a half. And so I think that this moment is one where he is speaking not only to elected officials who are having a crisis of confidence about his candidacy, but also to a lot of Democrats who are doing that as well. And that does not mean it's universal, because the numbers, and I think the reporting would tell us, to Van's point, that it's not a clear kind of universal belief among Democrats that he should be replaced. But there is a universal belief that that debate and the candidate who was in that debate is not suitable for what is going forward. Yeah. And the campaign set that up as a test for his fitness. And so we should not think of this conference as step one on that front. He has already flunked the first test in the terms of the debate. And I would also say we saw an interview with ABC that did not massage all those concerns anyway. So he's running out of rope here. And I think that's why you feel the increased pressure coming from the Hill, is because people want to see a different candidate and they want to see it fast.
Scott, a new poll came out, this morning, showing the race largely unchanged. In that, we'll see. A poll is a poll; it's a data point. But from that data point, the debate did not impact the numbers as much as certainly the conversations that we've all been having would indicate, and certainly not as much as Republicans hoped. So, does that surprise you, Scott?
One poll? No. I mean, if you want to know what the polls say, listen to the Democrats who are desperate for Joe Biden to drop out of the race. I mean, regardless of what public data you see, when elected officials with access to their private polling, when high-ranking Democrats are out begging for Joe Biden to do the right thing and step aside, you know what the polls say. The fact is, a tied race nationally means Donald Trump is going to win the Electoral College. I don't think this press conference, by the way, is going to change anything, whether he does well, whether he does poorly, or whether he does somewhere in the middle. First of all, he's already committed the gaffe of the day. I mean, he was trying to introduce President Zelensky of Ukraine. He called him President Putin. In terms of what the average American sees over the next 24 hours, they're going to see that clip of him messing up on the world stage over and over and over. And this press conference is not going to change it. But one press conference doesn't change what we know. This is a man in decline. It's not going to get better tomorrow. It's not going to get better in 2 weeks. And I'm with Van. I do think he's coming out on a carpet of prayer, and I'm one of them. I'm praying for him and his family to think hard about whether he's the right person to lead this country right now, and certainly whether he can look into a camera with a straight face and tell the American people, I'm capable of leading it for the next 4 years.
Right. Of course, he has done that repeatedly since the debate. But, we'll see what he does tonight. All of you, please stay with me, because we are now just a minute or two away, I believe, from this beginning. MJ Lee's outside the White House right now. And MJ, as the president prepares to have this press conference live in prime time in front of the country and the world, you're reporting that some top Democrats are furious with Biden's inner circle. How come?
Yeah, there is a lot of anger that is being directed at the president's inner circle of advisors and also his family members from so many Democrats across the party who believe that these people have created this operation and a system that is in place to have the president be highly choreographed, really stage managed at every point of the day. And they believe that that is exactly why that so many Democrats, even the people who interact with him on a regular basis, not to mention members of the public, did not have a full picture of how much the president had declined, which so many Democrats felt like they saw on full display for the first time on debate night. Whether it is these cabinet meetings that were described to us as being so meticulously scripted ahead of time, whether it is these advisors being incredibly sensitive to and controlling of the way that the president appears in front of cameras. One top Democrat that I was talking to who is in close touch with the president's inner circle put it this way. They said there's this general sense of just unbelievable holding your breath every time he does an event, every time he's with people. And they said these advisors had privately acknowledged that this situation is only going to get worse. And I was thinking, Aaron, waiting for this press conference, watching the president deliver remarks at this NATO summit, when he had that moment of mixing up President Zelensky and President Putin, I mean, you could very easily imagine so many Democrats that are tuning in to see how he'll do. Yeah, holding their breaths and wondering, is he going to fumble something? Is he going to make a mistake? And Aaron, I think that is just one of the biggest reasons why, even if the president were to stay in the race, and our reporting is that he has not changed his mind on that, why the road ahead is going to be so difficult for him, because there are so many Democrats in his party, people that are close to him, that basically believe at this point that it is politically untenable for him to move forward with this kind of scrutiny and this kind of microscope on him when he already has his work cut out for him trying to defeat Donald Trump.
Right, right. And as you point out, you know, when you mistake a name, you mistake a name. In his case now, it's different, right? Donald Trump confused Nikki Haley and Nancy Pelosi, Erdogan and Orban. But we don't keep hearing about that, right? Now, when it's Biden, it takes on such importance, which just shows the stakes here. I want to go straight to our Chief National Security Analyst, Jim Sciutto, who is there tonight and, of course, has been there at NATO throughout. And Jim, you have been talking, and this is a crucial thing too, when you talk about all of this coverage about the United States president, what does this do to American standing in the world and the way other world leaders perceive him and this country? You've been talking to some of those leaders and NATO officials today. And what are they telling you? What are they looking for here?
Yeah. I would say, Aaron, the dynamic is not dissimilar from what you hear from Democratic Party leaders, right? That what you hear publicly from many NATO officials, and I've spoken to several of them, is an expression of confidence in President Biden's leadership today and going forward. Privately, they say something quite different, which is they are watching him very closely. They see the challenges that he's facing domestically, and they have their own questions, frankly, about his decline over time. They don't want to say that publicly. It's quite understandable. They are in the midst of the largest war in Europe, of course, since World War II. They want to show unity, and in many ways they have shown unity here. But those questions about his leadership, and also, this is crucial, Aaron, the effect of this election on the alliance going forward, because they know that on the ballot are two American leaders, Trump and Biden, with two very different views of America's role in the world and America's role in NATO. And they see a potential American, if not withdrawal from NATO, at least retreat from its positions in the past. It's a very real question going forward, and very real fears for many you speak with here.
Yeah, an unmoored and unsettling feeling, I am sure, for them, as it is for so many who are watching this all unfold. All right, Jim is staying with us. Of course, we've got Kayla, MJ at the White House in the room as well as we await the president. I want to just bring in briefly longtime Democratic strategist James Carville as we await the president. Obviously, James, you've been vocal. You've said that Biden can't beat Trump in your view. You also believe he will ultimately be replaced with another Democratic nominee. So when you look at this stage tonight and you look at the president of the United States about to come out, and this had originally been planned for around 6:30. Now we expect him any moment. So he is running a bit late. What are you looking for?
Well, Well, first of all, as I've said, I don't think Biden can beat Trump, but I think it's been very difficult for him to beat Trump. I do. I think it's just kind of a done deal. We're just running on fumes now. And I understand that there are a lot of people in the White House that they don't want to give in, they don't want to give up, they feel like this is very unjust, and I completely understand this, but the fundraising and high-end fundraising Democratic Party is shut down. The congressional leadership is not even expressing tepid support. And we're circling the airport, and we just trying to figure out how to land this airplane. But to land the plane, we will.
Yep. All right, you know what, James? We're going to work on your audio. I thought it was me, but we are having a little bit of a challenge with it. So we're going to fix it. I'll come right back to you. In the meantime, Van, let me just go back to you on the back of the MJ Lee's reporting when she's saying that deep frustration and anger at Biden's inner circle. I'm just curious about your view on this, because these many of these people who seem to be angry are people who themselves have spent time with Biden. And they're people who have told others that when they have conversations with him about foreign policy or some sort of a policy issue, that he's sharp and on and to the point and follows up and asks questions and does all of that. And so they themselves were short, and now they're angry that the inner circle was sort of keeping something from them. And I'm just wondering if all that adds up to you.
Look, I think that people may have had some sense of disquiet having met with him. I've not met with him in the past, several months. But there may have been people who had some disquiet, some concern, but it may have been easily brushed aside. Listen, Anderson Cooper did a beautiful interview with him a few months ago about grief. It was beautiful. It's not like every day he was like the guy we saw. So I think what happened is there was a sense of disquiet. He's obviously was losing a step or two. You saw a little bit of the mumbling and the stumbling, but there was a floor there that I think people were used to and were expecting, and that floor just fell away at the debate. And I think that I think what the suspicion is that there may have been other times when the floor had fallen away, and that was not being reported out, and that was why there was so much control. But I don't think I think that people are wrong if they think there are a lot of Democratic officials or members of the press who had access to a Biden who looked like that and a Biden who acted like that and just kept their mouth shut. That is not true. People were uniformly, I know these people personally, uniformly stunned by what they saw, and they are angry that this may have been a recurring feature that was not revealed.
Kate, I interviewed the president a few weeks ago, a month ago, and it was in the middle of the afternoon. It was at a factory in Wisconsin. He traveled there. We talked for just under 20 minutes. He gave details. He had a strong message for Prime Minister Netanyahu about his red line in Rafah. He knew what he wanted to say. He was in control of it. That being said, he was old. He seemed physically frail, as we have all seen, but nothing like we saw at that debate. I mean, have you heard, Kate, from anybody in the inner circle that you are so close to after the debate? Did it suddenly come out that they had seen moments like we all witnessed on that debate stage?
No, absolutely not. I didn't hear that from anybody around the president. I didn't hear that from anybody in the inner circle. I think Van's point is exactly right, that, most people who interact with him come away feeling like he is in charge, he's confident, he's making decisions. There's not a universe of people who are somehow hiding the fact that Joe Biden regularly looks like he looked on that debate stage on the night of the 27th. So, I think the other thing to remember, too, about this suggestion that somehow his inner circle is, hiding him. I mean, these are people who care tremendously about him. They advocated to put him on the debate stage. They believed it was going to be a good political moment for him, that he would look sharp next to Donald Trump. They would not have done that had they thought that this was going to happen. So I think this was a really difficult night. It doesn't reflect what I've heard from others who are close to him. I haven't been there since March of 23. That's when I left. But every person I talked to a person has said they haven't seen the person that we saw on the debate stage. So I think, I certainly take them at their word. It was one bad night. And now his task is to go out and do what he's doing, which is to show that it was, in fact, one bad night.
Yeah. And I want to let everyone watching know, as we await the president, his national security team is now in the room, along with his press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, but John Kirby is there, Jake Sullivan is there, the defense secretary, Lloyd Austin, is there, Secretary of State Antony Blinken is there. They are all in that room right now. Instead, the voters that you're speaking to, is there anything that he can do that puts this to rest? In other words, that makes them go back to the way they were before the debate, where they knew he was what I witnessed. He could be frail, he is old, but that he was in command of what he wanted to do. Or is this going to be every single time he comes out now, it's Groundhog Day?
I do think that the nature of the debate was such that every single time he comes out, there will be a standard that folks are looking at to make sure it does not slip into the so-called one bad night. But I also think, even if we think before the debate, voters were already at the point where they thought that there were questions about Joe Biden's physical and kind of mental capabilities for the next 4 years. So going back to the pre-debate levels of voter confidence is not enough for the Biden campaign. They have to turn that around if they want a chance to win this race. And that was their task before the debate even started. I would suggest that the kind of question of cover-up is not the real right one to ask. The reporting doesn't bear that out, as folks have said. But there was always enough evidence to look ahead to the next 4 years and say that a lot of members of the American public were uncomfortable with the idea of an 86-year-old second-term president. That has been true consistently, and that was not the question that the Democrats were willing to engage in. And so that's what I think is at the core of people's upsetness here, is why was that not happening?
So, Scott, in the inner circles on the Republican side that you talk to, of the power players in the Republican Party, what do they expect to happen here?
Well, nobody knows. I mean, I started this week thinking Biden was going to survive, and then I saw Nancy Pelosi on TV yesterday reopen the door, and it seems like more people are coming out today. So nobody really knows what's going to happen. There's a huge amount of uncertainty, not just about Joe Biden, the candidate, but about Joe Biden, the president. So there's a lot of confusion on the Republican side. Obviously, running against Biden is preferred because he's so wounded right now. The American people have lost confidence in the job that he's done and in his fitness for office for the next 4 years. But honestly, Aaron, there is a tremendous amount of we don't have any idea. By the way, one comment on all these people who have been coming out with their concerns in the last few days that have apparently known about it for weeks or months or years. They are not doing this out of concern for Biden the man. They are not doing it out of concern for Biden the president. They're doing it out of concern of the polls that they've seen. To me, it's kind of craven, honestly, to see these Democrats all of a sudden come public with these concerns when they've known it all along just because the polls turn south.
All right, so on that, I want to bring James Carville back. And James, I'm sorry about your audio. I think we fixed it now. But I want to give you a chance to respond to what Scott just said, that this perception that because all the polls are bad, that you got more and more Democrats jumping on the bandwagon of Biden has to go. He used the word craven to describe that. How do you feel? And I want to make it clear. You've been saying this for quite some time, so you're not in that category. But do you feel that way about those who are now suddenly jumping on board?
Well, maybe Scott's shocked that someone's reading polls. I'm not. And if the polls are good, there would be the polling drives a lot of what happens in politics. But people, for a long time, they don't like this choice. 73% of the country doesn't like this choice. And the Republican Party is a hopeless band of mostly with a criminal nominee that they can all say what they want. He's not a criminal. He cannot tell the truth. He sold 34,000 lies. And the Democrats offer the country some kind of change, we're going to win. If we insist on sticking with the status quo, we're at risk of losing. It's quite that simple. The country does not want criminality, and that's what the Republican Party is offering. Plain and simple.
And so, and James, just in these final moments, may I just ask you briefly, what are you most focused on here as this press conference begins? We don't know how long it'll go.
Well, I think the step is it's inevitable that President Biden will choose not to run for re-election, and then we're going to have a really tight, messy procedure to pick our nominee, and we have to focus on that. And it is a very difficult and unique time in American politics. But the choice, I don't think the country wants to go down the path of criminality and habitual lying. I really don't. And I just want my party to give them something differently.
And as you can see, everyone in the room standing, the President of the United States is walking out to begin his press conference.
Thank you.
He approaches the podium, and let's listen.
Well, good evening. We just concluded this year's NATO summit, and the consensus among the members was it was a great success. It was especially momentous because it represented the 75th year of the most important military defense alliance in the world's history of the world. We should never forget that NATO grew out of the wreckage of World War II, the most destructive war in history. The idea was to create an alliance of free and democratic nations that would commit themselves to a compact of collective defense. Standing together, they knew we'd all be safer. An attack on one would be treated as an attack on all. And it's worked because a would-be aggressor knows if they attack one of us, they'll be attacked by all of us. Sending that message is the best way to deter aggression and prevent wars in the first place. For those who thought NATO's time had passed, they got a rude awakening when Putin invaded Ukraine. Some of the oldest and deepest fears in Europe roared back to life because once again, a murderous madman was on the march. But this time, no one cowered in appeasement, especially the United States. We collected intelligence that Russia was planning to invade Ukraine months before the invasion. I directed the intelligence community to be a significant amount of intelligence be declassified so I could start building an international coalition to oppose the invasion. Then in February, some of you remember, I warned the world that the invasion was imminent. I rallied a coalition of 50 nations from Europe to Asia to help Ukraine defend itself. Many foreign policy experts thought as Putin amassed Russian forces just 100 miles north of Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, but Putin thought it was the mother home of Russia. The capital would fall in less than a week. But the Ukrainian people, backed by a coalition to help build, stopped them. Today, Kyiv still stands, and NATO stands stronger than it has ever been. During the week of this summit, several heads of states made it a point in their statements to thank the United States and to thank me personally for all that NATO has achieved. NATO is not only stronger, NATO is bigger because we led the charge to bring in Finland and Sweden into the alliance, and it makes a gigantic difference. Excuse me. Meanwhile, my predecessor has made it clear he has no commitment to NATO. He's made it clear that he would feel no obligation to honor Article 5. He's already told Putin, and I quote, "Do whatever the hell you want." In fact, the day after Putin invaded Ukraine, here's what he said. It was genius. It was wonderful. Some of you forgot that, but that's exactly what he said. But I made it clear a strong NATO is essential to American security. And I believe the obligation of Article 5 is sacred. And I would remind all Americans, Article 5 is invoked only once in NATO's long history, and that was to defend America after 9/11. I made it clear that I will not bow down to Putin. I will not walk away from Ukraine. I will keep NATO strong. That's exactly what we did, and exactly what we'll continue to do. Now, the future of American policy is up to the American people. This is much more than the political question. It's more than that. It's a national security issue. Don't reduce this to the usual testament that people talk about, issues of being a political campaign. It's far too important. It's about the world we live in for decades to come. Every American must ask herself or himself, is the world safer with NATO? Are you safer? Is your family safer? I believe the American people know the answer to all those questions is yes. And I believe the American people understand that America is stronger because of our alliances. I believe the American consensus from Truman to Reagan to me still holds today. America cannot retreat from the world. We must lead the world. We are an indispensable nation, as Madeleine Albright wrote. Now let me turn to three other key issues. Just this morning, we had a great economic report showing inflation is down. Overall prices fell last month. Core inflation is the lowest it's been in 3 years. Prices are falling for cars, appliances, and airfares. Grocery prices have fallen since the start of the year. We're going to keep working to take down corporate greed to bring those prices down further. Meanwhile, Trump's calling for a 10% tariff on everything Americans buy, including food from overseas, vegetables, and other necessities. And economists tell us that would cost the average American working family another $2,500 a year. It's a tax of $2,500 a year. Second, our efforts to secure the border, southern border, is working. After Trump killed the bipartisan effort to secure the border, Republicans and Democrats had worked on, because he thought it would benefit me and make him a loser, Republicans walked away. So I took executive action last month. As a consequence, working with Mexico, border encounters have gone down over 50%. The current level is lower today than when Trump left office. Third, for months, the United States has been working to secure a ceasefire in Gaza, to bring the hostages home, to create a path for peace and stability in the Middle East. 6 weeks ago, I laid out a detailed plan in writing. It was endorsed by the UN Security Council, the G7. That framework is now agreed on by both Israel and Hamas. So I sent my team to the region to hammer out the details. These are difficult, complex issues. There's still gaps to close. We're making progress. The trend is positive. And I'm determined to get this deal done and bring an end to this war, which should end now. Let me conclude where I began. We're the United States of America. We are the indispensable nation. Our leadership matters. Our partnerships matter. This moment matters. We must rise to meet it. With that, I'll take your questions. I've been given a list of people to call on here. Reuters, Jeff Mason.
Mr. President, your political future has hung over the NATO summit a little bit this week. Speaker Pelosi made a point of suggesting that your decision on whether to stay in the race was still open. George Clooney and a handful of lawmakers have called on you to step aside. Reuters is reporting tonight that UAW leadership is concerned about your ability to win.
UAW just endorsed me, but go ahead.
Thank you. My question for you is, how are you incorporating these developments into your decision to stay? And separately, what concerns do you have about Vice President Harris's ability to beat Donald Trump if she were at the top of the ticket?
Look, I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she was not qualified to be president. So let's start there. Number one, the fact is that the consideration is that I think I'm the most qualified person to run for president. I beat him once, and I will beat him again. Secondly, the idea, I served in the Senate a long time. The idea that senators and congressmen running for office worry about the ticket is not unusual. And I might add, there are at least 5 presidents running or incumbent presidents who had lower numbers than I have now, later in the campaign. So there's a long way to go in this campaign. And so I'm just going to keep moving. And because, look, I got more work to do. We've got more work to finish. There's so much, we made so much progress. Think about it. Think about where we are economically relative to the rest of the world. Name me a world leader who wouldn't want to trade places with our economy. We've created over 800,000 manufacturing jobs, 1.5 million jobs. So things are moving. We got more to go. Working class people still need help. Corporate greed is still at large. Their prices, the corporate profits have doubled since the pandemic. They're coming down, and so I'm optimistic about where things are going. Danny Kemp, AFP.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to ask you about your, you mixed up Presidents Zelensky and Putin earlier today. And you now have sort of your key allies, including the British Prime Minister, the President of France, the German Chancellor having to step in and make excuses for you on that. Officials here are saying off the record that your decline has become noticeable. Hasn't this now, frankly, become damaging for America's standing in the world? Thank you.
Did you see any damage to our standing in my leading this conference? Have you seen a more successful conference? What do you think? And the Putin piece, I was talking about Putin, and I said, and now, at the very end, I said, here, I mean, Putin. I said, no, I'm sorry, Zelensky. And then I added 5 other names. Look, guys, the idea anybody suggests that we haven't had an incredibly successful conference. How many times did you hear in that conference, I know it sounds too self-serving, but other leaders, heads of state, in thanking me, saying the reason we're together is because of Biden, because Biden did the following. Look, folks, this is, well, anyway, I thought it was the most successful conference I've attended in a long time, and find me a world leader who didn't think it was. Next one, Nancy Cordes, CBS.
Thank you, Mr. President. You mentioned other instances in history where presidents have faced a challenge, but what makes this moment in history so unique is that it is not your enemies who are calling on you to reconsider your decision to stay in the race. It's your friends, supporters, people who think you've done a great job over the past 4 years. Have you spent time thinking about what it would mean for your legacy, which you've worked decades to build, if you stay in the race, despite the concerns that voters say they have, and you lose to someone who you yourself have argued is unfit to return to the Oval Office?
Well, look, I'm not in this for my legacy. I'm in this to complete the job I started. As you recall, understandably, many of you and many economists thought my initial initiatives that I put forward, can't do that, it's going to cause inflation, things are going to skyrocket, the debt's going to go up. What are you hearing now from mainstream economists? 16 economic Nobel laureates said I've done a hell of a job. That under my plan so far and what's going to happen in the future if I'm reelected, that things are going to get much better. Our economy is growing. I was determined when I got elected to stop the trickle-down economic theory, that if the wealthy did very well, everybody else would do well. My dad was a well-read, decent guy. I don't remember much trickling down on his kitchen table. Middle-class people and working-class people need help. And so what happened is I decided to implement, was able to implement as president, what I believed when I was a senator. And that is that the way to build this economy is from the middle out and the bottom up. That way we grow the economy. And the wealthy still do very well. They do fine. And guess what? Find me an economist, a mainstream economist who said we haven't done well. What have we not done that isn't working right now? And so we got more to do, though. We got to finish the job. And by the way, I come from the corporate state of the world. Delaware has more corporations registered in Delaware than every other state in the nation combined. I'm not anti-corporate, but corporate profits have doubled since the pandemic, doubled. It's time things get back in order a little bit. It's time, for example, if I'm reelected, we're going to make sure that rents are kept at 5% increase, corporate rents for apartments and the like and homes are limited to 5%. We're going to make a lot of changes that I've been talking about because we're going to continue to grow this economy. And by the way, I know, remember how I got so roundly criticized for being so pro-union? Not labor, union. Well, guess what? I've been the most pro-union labor president in history. Not a joke. And guess what? We had the Treasury Department do a study. When unions do better, everybody does better. Everybody does better. And we talk about how, for example, remember when we talked about getting the computer chip industry back in the United States? Used to be 40% of the industry. We invented the chip. 40% of the industry is in the United States. And former presidents decided that the best way to do it is find the cheapest labor in the world, send the product over there, and import what the product was. And so what did I do? I was told not to go over to Europe, to Asia, including Europe, but Asia. And I remember going to South Korea, convincing them to invest $20 billion in the United States to build computer chip factories. And I asked why when they finally decided to do it. And the answer was because you have the safest economy in the world and you have the best workers in the world. So the whole idea here is we've invested, there's over $50 billion in investment in computer chip manufacturing just coming in the bean. None of you thought that would happen. None of you thought that would happen. But it's happening. It's happening. And it's going to grow economies. All through, and by the way, red states and blue states. Matter of fact, there's as much in red states as in blue states. I've made no distinction. So my generic point is that the idea that we can't continue to build and grow the economy, make it fairer. And like I said, from my standpoint, when the middle class does well, that's when the whole economy grows. The poor have a shot, the wealthy do well. But the wealthy got to start paying their taxes.
As a follow-up, sir, you mentioned that your Vice President Kamala Harris would be ready to serve on day one. Can you elaborate on that? What is it about her attributes and her accomplishments over the last 4 years that make her ready to serve on day one if necessary?
First of all, the way she's handled the issue of freedom of women's bodies to have control over their bodies. Secondly, her ability to handle almost any issue on the board. This was a hell of a prosecutor. She was a first-rate person, and in the Senate, she was really good. I wouldn't have picked her unless I thought she was qualified to be president. From the very beginning, I made no bones about that. She is qualified to be president. That's why I picked her. Felicia Schwartz, Financial Times.
Thank you, Mr. President. The presidency is the most straining job in the world, and it's 24/7. How can you say you'll be up for that next year, in 2 years, in 4 years, given the limits you've acknowledged that you have today?
The limits I've acknowledged I have?
There's been reporting that you've acknowledged that you need to go to bed earlier and your evening around 8.
That's not true. Look, what I said was, instead of my every day starting at 7 and going to bed at midnight, it'd be smarter for me to pace myself a little more. And I said, for example, the 8, 7, 6 stuff, instead of starting a fundraiser at 9 o'clock, start at 8 o'clock. People get to go home by 10 o'clock. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about, and if you looked at my schedule since I made that stupid mistake in the campaign, in the debate, I mean, my schedule has been full bore. I've done, where's Trump been? Riding around in his golf cart, filling out his scorecard before he hits the ball? I mean, look, he's done virtually nothing. And I have, I don't know how many, don't hold me to it, roughly 20 major events. Some with thousands of people showing up. And so I just think it's better. I always have an inclination, whether I was playing sports or doing politics, just to keep going, not stop. I just got to just pace myself a little more. Pace myself. And the next debate, I'm not going to be traveling into 15 time zones a week before. Anyway, that's what it was about. That's what it was about. And by the way, even with that, I love my staff, but they add things all the time, at the very end. I'm catching hell from my wife for that. Anyway. I'm sorry, Zeke Miller, Associated Press.
Thank you, Mr. President. Two questions for you. First, on the NATO summit, President Zelensky, in your meeting with him, he pressed you to lift your limitations on the Ukrainian use of American weapons, saying that, in his public remarks afterwards, saying that Ukraine cannot win the war unless those limitations are lifted. Are you reconsidering your position on that? And then secondly, following up on Felicia's question there, leaders of your own party have said that they're not worried about that debate. They're worried about the next bad night and the bad night after that. How can you reassure the American people that you are up to the task and that there won't be more bad nights at a debate stage or somewhere else?
First thing about Zelensky asking for the ability to strike deep into Russia. We've allowed Zelensky to use American weapons in the near term, in the near or abroad, into Russia. Whether or not he should be attacked. For example, should Zelensky, he's not. If he had the capacity to strike Moscow, strike the Kremlin, would that make sense? It wouldn't. The question is, what's the best use of the weaponry he has, and the weaponry we're getting to him? I've gotten him more long-range capacity, as well as defensive capacity. And so our military is where I'm following the advice of my commander-in-chief, the chief of staff of the military, as well as the Secretary of Defense and our intelligence people. And we're making a day-to-day basis on what they should go, how far they should go in. That's a logical thing to do. Second question related to
Bad nights, sir. How can you reassure the American people that you won't have more bad nights, whether they be on a debate stage or it's a matter of foreign policy?
Well, I tell you what, the best way to assure them is the way I assure myself. And that is, am I getting the job done? Am I getting the job done? Can you name me somebody who's got more major piece of legislation passed in 3.5 years? I created 2,000 jobs just last week. So if I slow down, I can't get the job done. That's a sign that I shouldn't be doing it. But there's no indication of that yet. None. Who I got here? Merrick, Pulaski Radio.
Thank you, Mr. President. How are you?
I'm well.
The elections in the US have consequences around the world. You have pretty high standing in Europe. I just asked President Macron about you, and he said we are happy to have him as the President of the United States. But there is a concern. Many people in Poland and across Europe are worried that the former president may win the election. And there's a lot of concern that Donald Trump may weaken NATO, stop supporting Ukraine, or push Ukraine to give up territories to Russia.
They're correct.
And yourself was warning just 2 minutes ago about it. So my question is, do you think that Europe will be left on its own if Donald Trump wins the election? And what's your advice to European leaders to prepare for possible US disengagement?
Well, look, I think, how can I say this without sounding too self-serving? I've not had any of my European allies come up to me and say, Joe, don't run. What I hear them say is, you've got to win. You can't let this guy come forward. It'd be a disaster. It'd be a disaster. I mean, I think he said in one of his rallies, don't hold me to this, recently, where NATO, I just learned about NATO, or something to that effect. Foreign policy has never been his strong point. And he seems to have an affinity to people who are authoritarian. That worries, as I tell you from Poland, that worries Europe. That worries Poland. And nobody, including the people of Poland, think that if he wins in Ukraine, he's going to stop in Ukraine. that that's going to be the end of it. And so what I can say is, I think I'm the best qualified person to do the job, to make sure that Ukraine does not fall, that Ukraine succeeds, that the European alliance stays strong. You may recall, no one was talking about Finland joining NATO. I remember talking to Putin right after we got elected in Geneva, and he was talking about what we should do. We couldn't be in Eastern Europe, etc. And I said, you're looking for the Finlandization of Ukraine. I said, you're going to get the NATOization of Finland. And about 4 weeks later, I got a call. That's not true. Probably 5 months later, from the president of Finland, could he come and see me? In my office, I invited him to the Oval Office. We sat down and talked. He said he wanted to join NATO. Could I help? And I did. It wasn't automatic. And then I got a call from the Swedes. I beg your pardon? And so Finland joined NATO. 800-mile border is a significant, and they were already allies, but they weren't part of NATO. And you heard, I think you heard, maybe, I can't recall what he said in our closed meeting, but he wouldn't mind it being repeated. He said, we decided in Finland, the people of Finland decided they had to be part of NATO. It was in our interest because of the joint ability to be together, to dissuade any attack on Finland. And the same thing with Sweden. It took a lot of selling to some folks, particularly in Turkey and other places, to agree to the expansion. But it expanded. And we're a hell of a lot stronger because of it. We're more secure because of it. And by the way, I was able to get 50 other nations, 50, to support Ukraine. 50. We were able to bring about a coalition of Europe and Asia, Japan and South Korea. I just we talked about AUKUS, and we talked about the relationship between Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, the United States. We're making the world safer and stronger because we have to deal with the new arrangement that exists in the world. The Cold War is over. The post-war era is over. What is going to replace it? And I respectfully suggest I have a pretty good idea what that should be. I've convinced a lot of people to follow it. And we're just going to get stronger. David Sanger. Where's it?
Thank you, Mr. President.
Be nice, David.
Mr. President, the NATO declaration that was issued yesterday was very notable because it described China as a decisive enabler of the war in Ukraine for its provision of critical goods to the Russians. That's part of a broader partnership that seems to have cemented in place in the past 2 or 3 years. I think one that you were a little bit doubtful of when we asked you about it some time ago. So I'd be interested to know whether you have a strategy now of trying to interrupt the partnership between China and Russia, and whether or not in a second term you would pursue that, if you could describe that strategy to us. And along the way, could you also tell us whether you think, just to follow up on Felicia's question, that if you were in a room with Vladimir Putin again, the way you were 3 years ago, or with President Xi, that a few years from now you will be able to go negotiate with them, handle them one-on-one?
Well, the first part of the question is, we discussed and I raised in the NATO summit, and others raised, the future of China's involvement, what they're going to do. What they're doing with Russia in terms of accommodating, facilitating, they're getting access to additional, they're not supplying weapons themselves, they're supplying mechanisms for them to be able to get weapons. And China's position is basically, and I've spent more time with Xi Jinping than any world leader has, over 90 hours since being vice president all the way through, for real. And by the way, I handed all my notes. But my point is that she believes that China is a large enough market that they can entice any country, including European countries, to invest there in return for commitments from Europe to do A, B, C, or D, or not to do certain things. What's happened is we had a long discussion about what we have to make clear. China has to understand that if they are supplying Russia with information and capacity, along with working with North Korea and others to help Russia in armament, that they're not going to benefit economically as a consequence of that by getting the kind of investment they're looking for. And so, for example, we're in a situation where, and we've reestablished direct contact with China after that, remember the balloon, quote unquote, going down, and all of a sudden things came to an end? Well, we set up a new mechanism. There's a direct line between Xi and me, and our military has direct access to one another, and they contact one another when we have problems. The issue is that we have to make sure that she understands there's a price to pay for undercutting both the Pacific Basin as well as Europe, and as it relates to Russia and dealing with Ukraine. And so for example, if you want to invest in China, as you know this area really well. If you want to invest in China, you have to have a 51% Chinese owner. You have to make sure that you do by their rules. And you don't have the authority, and you have to provide all access to all the data and information you have. There was a while there, as you recall, the last administration and other administrations, where the access to that market was enticing enough to get companies to come in because they had access to over 1 billion people in a market, not 1 billion, but a lot of people in the market. And so they were doing it. But that got curtailed when we started saying we're going to play by the same rules. For example, the idea they don't abide by the international rules related to subsidizing products by the government funding. So guess what? They're not going to be able to export their electric vehicles to the United States without a significant tariff. Others are doing the same thing around the world. But it is a concern. It is a concern that you have both China, North Korea, Russia, Iran, countries that are not necessarily coordinated in the past, looking to figure out how they can have impact.
Interrupt that impact?
Yes, I do, but I'm not prepared to talk about the detail of it in public. And I think you'll see that some of our European friends are going to be curtailing their investment in Russia. In China, as long as China continues to have this indirect help to Russia in terms of being able to help their economy as well as help them in as a consequence of that their ability to fight in Ukraine. The other thing that we talked a lot about is that, and I raised it, and I didn't hear any. I can't swear that everyone agreed because not everyone got to talk about it, but we need a new industrial policy in the West. For example, we talked about how both the EU as well as NATO has to be able to begin to build their own munition capacity, has to be able to generate their own capacity to provide for weapons and the ability to, it came as a surprise to some of us how we had fallen behind in the West in terms of the ability to construct new material, new weaponry, new everything from vehicles to weapon systems. And so one of the things that came out of this was we're going to be meeting again with a number of my colleagues, my European colleagues, is what do we do to increase the capacity of the West, particularly in Europe and Japan, to be able to generate the kind of ability to produce their own weapon systems. Not just for themselves, but to be able to generate that. It's the same, it's what Russia's trying to figure out. That they went to China and they didn't get the weapons, but then they went to North Korea. But we're going to be in a position where the West is going to become the industrial base for the ability to have all the defensive weapons that we need. That was a discussion as well.
Mr. President, I'm not sure you answered on whether you would be ready to go deal with Putin and Xi 2 or 3 years from now.
I'm ready to deal with them now and 3 years from now. Look, like I said, I'm dealing with Xi right now and direct contact with him. I have no good reason to talk to Putin right now. There's not much that he is prepared to do in terms of accommodating any change in his behavior. And, but there isn't any world leader I'm not prepared to deal with. But I understand the generic point is Putin ready to talk? I'm not ready to talk to Putin unless Putin's ready to change his behavior. And the idea, look, Putin's got a problem. First of all, in this war that he is supposedly have won, and by the way, I think, don't hold me to the exact number, but I think that Russia had 17.3% of Ukraine that they've conquered. Now it's 17.4. I mean, in terms of percentage of territory. They've not been very successful. They've caused horrible damage, loss of life, but they've also lost over 350,000 troops, military, killed or wounded. They have over 1 million people, particularly young people with technical capability, leaving Russia because they see no future there. They've got a problem. But what they do have control of is they are very good at controlling and running the public outcry that relates to how they use mechanisms to communicate with people. They lie like hell to the constituencies. They lie like hell about what's going on. And so the idea that we're going to be able to fundamentally change Russia in the near term is not likely. But one thing for certain, if we allow Russia to succeed in Ukraine, they're not stopping in Ukraine. I recommend, I know you know this because you've written about it, read Putin's speech after they moved in, what it was all about in Kyiv. It wasn't about just, anyway, read what his objective is. And anyway, but so I think that I'm prepared to talk to any leader who wants to talk, including if Putin called me and wanted to talk. Last time I talked to Putin was trying to get him to work on an arms control agreement related to nuclear weapons in space. That didn't go very far. So my point is, I'm prepared to talk to anybody, but I don't see any inclination. There is an inclination on the part of the Chinese to keep in contact with me because they're not sure where this all goes. And look what's happened in Asia. We have strengthened the Asian Pacific area more than anyone else has. We just put together with, today I brought on, I asked our NATO allies that we bring on the group from the South Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Australia. I already mentioned Australia. And I met twice now, I think, with the 14 leaders of the Pacific Island nations. And we've slowed down what's going on there. We've slowed down China's reach. But there's a lot of work to do. This is a moving target, and I don't take it lightly. Sam from NPR.
Thank you, Mr. President. Asma Khalid with NPR. I have two questions. Earlier, you spoke about the ceasefire plan between Israel and Hamas. We're now looking at 10 months of war, and I'm curious if there's anything that you feel personally you wish you would have done differently over the course of the war. And then secondly, if I may, I wanted to ask you about your presidential campaign. I remember covering your campaign in 2020, and there was a moment where you referred to yourself as a, quote, bridge candidacy, a transition to a younger generation of leaders. I want to understand what changed.
Two things. Let's go back to when you talked about would I have changed anything that's happening with Israel and the Palestinians and the Palestinian movement. The answer is, as you recall, from the very beginning, I went to Israel, but I also got immediate contact with al-Sisi in Egypt. I met with the King of Jordan. I met with most of the Arab leaders to try to get a consensus going as to what had to be done to deal with getting more aid and food and medicine into the Gaza Strip. And we pushed it really hard. And Israel occasionally was less than cooperative, number one. The Israeli War Cabinet, I've been dealing with Israel since Golda Meir. Some of the reporters around here cover me all the time have heard me say this. The first time I met with Golda Meir, I sat across from her at her desk, and her assistant was Rabin sitting next to me. That's how far back I go. I know Israel well, and I support Israel. But this war cabinet is one of the most conservative war cabinets in the history of Israel. And there's no ultimate answer other than a two-state solution here. And so what was able to be done in terms of the plan I put together was it would be a process for a two-state solution. And we get the Arab nations to, particularly from Egypt all the way to Saudi Arabia, to be in a position where they would cooperate in the transition so that they could keep the peace in Gaza without Israeli forces staying in Gaza. The question has been from the beginning, what's the day after in Gaza? And the day after in Gaza has to be, the end of the day after has to be no occupation by Israel in the Gaza Strip, as well as the ability for us to get in and out as rapidly as you can, all that's needed there. I've been disappointed that some of the things that I've put forward have not succeeded as well, like the port we attached from Cyprus. I was hopeful that would be more successful. But that's why when I went to Israel immediately after the massacres that occurred at the hands of Hamas, the one thing I said to the Israelis, and I met with the War Cabinet and with Bibi, don't make the same mistake America made after bin Laden. There's no need to occupy anywhere. Go after the people who did the job. You may recall, I still get criticized for it, but I was totally opposed to the occupation and trying to unite Afghanistan. Once we got bin Laden, we should have moved on, because it was not no one's ever going to unite that country. I've been over every inch of that, not every inch, the entirety from the poppy fields all the way to the north. I said, don't make the same mistake we made. Don't think that's what you should be doing, is doubling down. We'll help you find the bad guys, Sinwar and company. And all this criticism about I wouldn't provide when the weapons they needed. I'm not providing them 2,000-pound bombs. They cannot be used in Gaza or any populated area without causing great human tragedy and damage. But remember what happened when you had the attack on Israel with rockets and ballistic missiles. I was able to unite the Arab nations as well as Europe, and nothing happened. Nothing got hurt. It sent an incredible lesson to what was going on from the Middle East. So there's a lot of things, in retrospect, I wish I had been able to convince the Israelis to do. But the bottom line is we have a chance now. It's time to end this war. Doesn't mean walk away from going after Sinwar and Hamas. And if you notice, you know better than most, there is a growing dissatisfaction on the West Bank from the Palestinians about Hamas. Hamas is not popular now. And so there's a lot of moving parts. I just have to keep moving to make sure that we get as much done as we can toward a ceasefire, and get those. And by the way, look at the numbers in Israel. I mean, my numbers are better in Israel than they are here. But then again, they're better than a lot of other people here too. But anyway.
Bridge candidacy in 2020, you referred to yourself as being a bridge candidate for a younger, fresher generation of Democratic leaders, and I wanted to know what changed.
What changed was the gravity of the situation I inherited in terms of the economy, our foreign policy, and domestic division. And I think, I won't put words in anybody's mouth, most presidential historians give me credit for having accomplished more than most any president since Johnson and maybe before that to get major pieces of legislation passed. And what I realized was my long time in the Senate had equipped me to have the wisdom to know how to deal with the Congress, to get things done. We got more major legislation passed that no one thought would happen. And I want to finish it, to get that finished. If tomorrow, if we had a circumstance where there was a lineup and I hadn't inherited what I did and we just moved things along, anyway, it's going to change.
Last question.
Haley Bull, Scripps. Or no, Josh Weingrove, I'm sorry, was the next one. I'll do 2 more questions.
Thank you, Mr. President. Many of your colleagues, Democrats on the Hill, are watching tonight as they assess what they want to say about your candidacy. I'm wondering how you're thinking of this right now. It seems like your answer is clear, but they're watching how things go tonight, tomorrow in Michigan, next week in Texas and Nevada. Are you thinking that way about how the next week or 2 goes would inform your...
Am I using that way, you said?
Are you thinking that way about how the next 2 weeks go? Will that affect your decision, or are you fully determined on running in November as the party's nominee?
I'm determined on running, but I think it's important that I allay fears by let them see me out there. Let me see them out. You know, for the longest time it was, Biden's not prepared to sit with us unscripted. Biden's not prepared to, anyway. And so what I'm doing is, and I've been doing, I think we've done over 20 major events from Wisconsin to North Carolina, to demonstrate that I'm going out in the areas where we think we can win, where we can persuade people to move our way, or people are already there. And here, look, the other thing is, we have the most extensive campaign organization of anybody's had in a long, long time. We have well over 1,000 volunteers knocking on doors, making phone calls, making tens of thousands of phone calls. We have headquarters, I forget exactly how many, I don't want to cite a number and then find out I'm off, but we have scores of headquarters in all the toss-up states. We're organized, we're moving, and that's awful hard to replace in the near term. And here's the other thing. I was in the Senate a long time. Very proud of what I've done in the Senate. I was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee for a long time, and I was chairman or ranking member and chairman of the Judiciary Committee. I'm going to be going down to the Johnson Library. Anyway, I'm going to be going around making the case of the things that I think we have to finish and how we can't afford to lose what we've done or backslide on civil rights, civil liberties, women's rights. There's that little button we have. Control guns, not girls. I mean, the idea, we're sitting around, this is where Kamala's so good as well. We're sitting around, more children are killed by a bullet than any other cause of death. The United States of America. What the hell are we doing? What are we doing? We got a candidate saying, promised the NRA, don't worry, I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to do anything. You got a Supreme Court that is what you might call the most conservative court in American history. This is ridiculous. There's so much we can do still, and I'm determined to get it done. It's about freedom. And by the way, I'll end this. Well, I'm not going to do that. Haley has to come up too. But I remember I made a speech on democracy in Philadelphia at Independence Hall. And I'm not being critical, just observing. The bulk of the press said, what the hell is he talking about that for? Democracy. You did. Democracy is not an issue. Democracy is not an issue. Except the polling data showed 60% of the people knew I was right, thought I was right. I'm not asking you a question. You don't have to answer, obviously. But do you think our democracy is under siege based on this court? Do you think democracy is under siege based on Project 2025? Do you think he means what he says when he says he's going to do away with the civil service, eliminate the Department of Education, make sure, we've never been here before. And that's the other reason why you say, hand off to another generation. I've got to finish this job. I've got to finish this job because there's so much at stake.
We've had some discussions over the past few days with your press secretary about the question of health exams. And you said you take a cognitive test every day in this job. Are you open to taking another physical or test before the election? Governor Whitmer of Michigan, for instance, said it wouldn't hurt to take a test.
Well, look, two things. One, I've taken 3 significant and intense neurological exams by a neurologist. In each case, as recently as February. And they say I'm in good shape, okay? Although I do have a little problem with my left foot because it's not as sensitive because I broke my foot and didn't wear the boot. But I'm good. I'm tested every single day about my neurological capacity to do decisions I make every day. You talk to my staff, all of you talk to my staff. Sometimes my staff talks a lot. But the fact of the matter is, I don't think you have them telling you that all the major ideas we've undertaken haven't been in part initiated by me. I remember when the staff and I said, I'm going to go to South Korea, we're going to get the chip. What are you doing? I'm going to get Japan and Korea back together again after essentially having hostilities toward one another since the end of World War II. I'm going to move and see that we can expand it. The only thing age does is help you with it. Creates a little bit of wisdom if you pay attention. And so the point I'm making is, I think it's important that if the neurologist tells me he thinks I need another exam, and by the way, I've laid every bit of the record out. Hadn't hidden a thing. You ought to ask Trump for his, okay? I laid it all out. And every single day, I'm surrounded by good docs. If they think there's a problem, I promise you, or even if they don't think it's a problem, they think I should have a neurological exam again, I'll do it. But no one's suggesting that to me now. And I'll ask you another question. No matter what I did, no one's going to be satisfied. Did you have 7 docs? Did you have 2? Who'd you have? Did you do this? How many times did you? So I am not opposed if my doctors tell me I should have another neurological exam, I'll do it. But that's where I am. Haley Bull, Scripps.
Thank you, Mr. President. You said you're making decisions on a day-to-day basis when it comes to support for Ukraine. Does that mean you have not closed the door on further considering lifting restrictions for U.S.-made weapons inside Russia? And if I may, your convention is coming up where your delegates are pledged to make you the official nominee. If they have second thoughts, are they free to vote their conscience?
Obviously, they're free to do whatever they want, but I get overwhelming support. Overwhelming support. I won, I forget how many votes I won in the primary. Overwhelming. And so tomorrow, if all of a sudden I show up at the convention, everybody says, we want somebody else, that's the democratic process. It's not going to happen.
Even if that means they vote for someone else?
Sure. Look, I'll end this with this. I served in the Senate a long time. I understand the impetus of candidates running for local office and whether they think the topic can help them or not. In my state of Delaware, which was a very, at least it was a red state when I started, in terms of where you now talk red and blue. I don't recall most of the Democratic presidents winning my state when I was a candidate. The truth of the matter is I understand the self-interest of every candidate. If they think that, running with Biden at the top is going to hurt them, then they're going to run away. I get it. But so far, go and look at the polling data in their states. Look at the in-depth, and by the way, I think you'd all acknowledge, and you're all experts. I'm not being solicitous about the president. You're experts on this stuff. How accurate does anybody think the polls are these days? I can give you a series of polls where you have likely voters, me versus Trump, where I win all the time. When the unlikely voters vote, he wins sometimes. The bottom line is all the polling data right now, which I think is premature because the campaign really hasn't even started. I mean, it hadn't started in earnest yet. Most of the time, it doesn't start till after September, after Labor Day. So a lot can happen. But I think I'm the best I believe I'm the best qualified to govern. And I think I'm the best qualified to win. But there are other people who could beat Trump too. But it's awful start from scratch. And, we talk about, money raised. We're not doing bad. We got about $220 million in the bank. We're doing well. So with that, you have any want to follow up on any of that you just asked me?
Yes. You earlier explained confidence in your vice president.
Yes.
If your team came back and showed you data that she would fare better against former President Donald Trump, would you reconsider your decision to stay in the race?
No, unless they came back and said, there's no way you can win. Me. No one's saying that. No poll says that. Okay. Thank you.
This ends tonight's press conference. Thanks, everybody. This concludes.
Respectfully, earlier you misspoke in your opening answer. You referred to Vice President Harris as Vice President Trump. Right now, Donald Trump is using that to mock your age and your memory. How do you combat that criticism from tonight?
Listen to him.
This concludes tonight's press conference. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, everyone.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us. Saying I've got overwhelming support and I've got to finish the job. President Biden has just wrapped up a press conference which began with 8 minutes of prepared remarks, followed by more than 50 minutes of unscripted Q&A until just now. Starting us off tonight, CNN Chief National Affairs Correspondent Jeff Zeleny, CNN Political Director David Chalian, Ashley Etienne, who served as Communications Director for Vice President Harris, former Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger, CNN's Manu Raju at the Capitol, and Democratic strategist Paul Begala. David Chalian, let me start with you. Did the president put concerns about his candidacy to rest tonight enough?
Well, certainly not. He obviously was up there for nearly an hour and was able to speak on a variety of topics, but he spoke in sort of the way we've come accustomed to hearing Joe Biden. Certainly nothing that resembled what occurred on the debate stage, but obviously still at times rambling, at times mixing up words. That last question you heard about at the very top of the presser, mixing up saying Vice President Trump instead of Vice President Harris. But I think, Anderson, what was most telling for me from this, you asked the question, did he assuage concerns? He actually himself acknowledged that he is still on a mission of trying to allay concerns, as he said. And I thought that was very telling because a week ago in that George Stephanopoulos interview, we heard a defiant President Biden. We heard somebody who said this conversation about whether I'm going to be the nominee or not is over. I have decided. He said that at the Wisconsin rally last Friday. That was not, my observation was he was in a bit of a different headspace tonight. He certainly said, I am keeping on. We are going to keep on moving through this. He said he is going to continue to run this race. But it was a different tone on that stuff that seemed to open the idea. He said he doesn't think he's the only one that can beat Donald Trump. He said nobody yet has presented him with evidence that he doesn't have a viable winning path to the presidency. Well, that still may come. That seems to me that he was sort of opening up some metrics that he's willing to consider, perhaps. This was not a president who was shutting down the notion and the conversation, or a president that seemed unaware that his party is still looking for him to grapple with this decision, and they don't consider it closed. And I think tonight we saw him in a different headspace about this.
Paul Begala, what did you see?
I saw substantive mastery. I mean, my goodness, it was a tour de force and a tour of the world. We talk a lot, of course, about NATO and Ukraine, but about China, about Israel, Gaza. He seemed to have the substance really at his command. Stylistically, though, you still had the soft voice. You didn't have the kind of catastrophic failure he had at the debate, but you also didn't have the same sort of command that he had at his inaugural. So the substance was great, the style not. He is already getting static for slipping and saying Vice President Trump, which, anybody could do that, Tucker. You just get a name wrong.
Thanks, James Carville. So, Ashley, what did you make of the news conference?
I think David's a bit of a Debbie Downer. So far, what I've heard is like a little Debbie Downer. I thought the president was incredibly strong. He was very forceful, deep on the substance in terms of foreign policy and domestic policy. I think he definitely bought himself some more time tonight. But I'm not sure that the bleeding will stop. What I'm hearing from members on the Hill is that there's deep frustration with how the president and his team have handled this situation. I maintain that it was a mistake for the president not to go up to the caucus meeting this week, or not at the very least to call into the caucus. This is a family matter. He should have addressed it in that way. But today's performance was incredibly strong. It bolsters his point that he had a bad debate night. We've now seen him in a press conference and interview and at rallies, and he seems a bit incredibly strong. But here's the outstanding thing, Anderson. The president now has to prove that he can unite this party, and not just unite the party, but to inspire the party to get behind him and refocus our efforts on Donald Trump. And that's the challenge before the president now.
Jeff, you've been reporting all day on this. How does the president's performance tonight square with the reporting you've been doing?
Anderson, there's no doubt that he has a command of these issues, something that he has dealt with really for decades. But that really wasn't the overall purpose of the press conference. Just talking to a senior Democratic advisor who is in close touch with many Hill Democrats tells me this: I don't think anyone from the Hill is going to stand down after this. So the big question here tonight is, did this stop the bleeding?
Meaning anyone on the Hill who wants him to right. Meaning anyone on the Hill who wants him to go is going to stand down.
Right. Exactly. We've heard so many Democrats who've been saying, wait and see. Let's wait and see how he does. They have concerns on the campaign. This is unlikely to change the trajectory of that. David Chalian is correct in terms of us reading the tone. Not as combative, not as defiant. I actually asked one of his advisors about that. They chalked it up to the setting of NATO that he was at this press conference. We will see, but he definitely was even open to, at the very end there, a reporter asked if he was open to letting his delegates to do whatever they choose, and he said he was. So we will see going forward here if he returns that combativeness. But we are in a very different place than we were at the beginning of the week when he was very defiant on Morning Joe, and he has learned a lot this week, including from former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, those words and the fact that they're likely to speak in the coming days, if not tomorrow, that is going to determine the support among Democrats for him going forward here. So, yes, the press conference, I've covered a lot of his press conferences. It was fine. But tonight, fine is likely not good enough to change this trajectory, Anderson.
Manu, what are you hearing tonight from lawmakers?
Yeah, there's signs that those calls for him to step aside are not going to go away, despite what Democrats say was a better performance, of course, than the debate from 2 weeks ago. In fact, just moments ago, right after this press conference ended, Jim Himes, who is a top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, just put out a statement calling on Joe Biden to step aside from this race. He writes in a statement, Anderson, he says that he praises Joe Biden's legacy, his record. He says it's because of those traits and in consideration of that legacy that I hope President Biden will step away from the presidential campaign. He goes on to say that the 2024 election will define the future of American democracy, and they must put forth the strongest candidate possible to confront the threat posed by Trump's promised MAGA authoritarianism. So that is in line with what I've been hearing going into this press conference. Jim Himes becomes the 15th member of Congress to call for Joe Biden to step aside. 14 before this press conference, but there was an expectation that there would be more afterwards. They were going to give Joe Biden at least the opportunity to make the argument, even if they had made their mind up already privately. And the discussion privately has been much more intense than what we have seen publicly. And the public discussion, of course, has been intense, but there's been so much concern about Biden, that Biden's not just his debate performance, but how that has been baked into the electorate, and that it's something that they believe he can't overcome ahead of a critical election. So expect more names, significant names. Jim Himes is someone who has sway within the Democratic Party, has a lot of influence among the House Democrats. Expect many more to come forward, either to go close to the line of saying he should consider stepping aside or saying he should step aside altogether. But as Joe Biden indicated at that press conference, he has no plans to at the moment. He says that watch me on the campaign trail. So it could take another couple of weeks for this all to play out, Anderson. But as they move closer and closer to the convention, it's going to get harder and harder to find any new candidate to replace Joe Biden.
Simona, I just wanted to confirm Jim Himes' statement, Congressman Himes' statement, that was released after the press conference, like seconds after the press conference.
Seconds after. There's a post at 8:29 p.m. Eastern, Anderson. So this was ready to come out pretty much when this is done. And he makes it very clear. He says his accomplishments are immense. His legacy as a great president is secure. He must not risk that legacy, urging him to step aside, Anderson.
Congressman Kinzinger, what did you see tonight? What do you think happens now?
Yeah, look, I think it was fine. But, we wouldn't even, we'd be looking at the next, cat video on the internet if it wasn't for what happened at the debate. And so I think everybody was kind of looking at this press conference saying, this is going to be the magical thing that changes the discussion. It's not. It's going to have to be, if Biden decides to stay in this race, it's going to have to be a number of things like this. It's going to have to be a lot of traveling, a lot of activity for people to slowly kind of regain that trust that, okay, that debate was a simple fluke. I think here's an important point. Joe Biden said his delegates were free to do whatever they want. Now, obviously, they're not going to. They're going to stay with Joe Biden. But I want to point out a huge difference between him and Donald Trump, between the Democrats and the Republican Party. I hear so many Democrats complaining about this discussion that's going on, and we have to show the kind of unity Republicans show, and we're showing this division. It's bull crap. The Republicans are not showing unity. It's a cult, and everybody that used to speak out against the dear leader in the Republican Party has been excommunicated or kicked out. So nobody has the ability to even speak out, or they'll be excommunicated. This discussion going on in the Democratic Party is healthy for a party in America. Now, if it went on until November, it would be damaging. But in the short term, this is what an American political party is supposed to be like.
Paul Begala, just in terms of, the clock, which is ticking, and as Nancy Pelosi pointed out the other day, what happens tomorrow? What happens this weekend? How does it resolve one way or another?
Well, you just used the two most powerful, hopeful words in every Democrat's vocabulary, Nancy Pelosi. You know, there's that great Carrie Underwood song, Jesus, Take the Wheel. I'm for Nancy, take the wheel. Okay, she's even older than President Biden. She handed off her gavel to a younger generation of leadership, and the world still turned on its axis. The party didn't fall apart. In fact, Hakeem Jeffries, her successor, wasn't even opposed in his bid for Democratic leadership in the House. She sets an example here. At the same time, I do know that President Biden has enormous respect for her. And she said something very important this week. She said, essentially, I'm reading between the lines, let's get through this NATO summit. It's terribly important. President Biden does a great job astride the global stage. Let's get through that and then assess. Well, that begins tomorrow morning. And the president pointed the way to his speech Monday in Austin, my hometown, at the LBJ Library. Lloyd Doggett, the congressman from Austin, is the first one to call for President Biden to give up the nomination. And he has suggested maybe the president goes to LBJ's library, commemorates, he was going to receive an award and commemorate the 1964 Civil Rights Bill. And then maybe he does what Johnson did and hand off the gavel. So that's already what some Democrats are starting to say.
Ashley Etienne, I'm wondering, you know, just in the time since we last talked, what else you are hearing from supporters of the president or those who want him gone? Because, I mean, there was such anticipation about these remarks, and people can kind of interpret them, I guess, with whatever opinion they have and see it through that lens. Some will say, look, he was very fluent on a number of foreign policy issues. You know, you can also point to, you know, him calling Zelensky Putin and his Vice President Trump and, you know, the slowness with which he spoke. It doesn't seem like this press conference, which many people said was going to resolve things one way or another. Do you think it did resolve it for anybody?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think those that are dug in on both sides. You know, I'm hearing that there's two main factions within the Democratic caucus on both ends of the chamber. And that is, you know, there's obviously those who believe that, you know, if the Democratic Party is going to be fighting for the viability of our democracy, we have to maintain that democratic process within our own party. We can't disenfranchise voters. Primary voters have already voted for Joe Biden, so we should stick with Joe Biden. But then on the other side, the flip side of that is obviously those who want Joe Biden to step down. But the question that they can't answer at this point, and I've heard that this has been the biggest fights on Capitol Hill as of late in those private meetings, is who is the alternative? What is the alternative to Joe Biden? You can't ask the president to go step down and you don't have a plan B. You don't have a plan to replace him, and there's no consensus even around that plan. And that's what I'm actually hearing from the members within the caucus, and that's creating a lot of frustration, animosity within the caucus, and really uncertainty.
Jeff Zeleny, I understand you have some breaking news on the efforts behind the scene to convince President Biden to end his campaign. What are you hearing?
Anderson, we are learning tonight that throughout the course of this week, as we've seen the public words from former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, we're learning that she has had a private conversation earlier this week with former President Barack Obama. They have talked about this matter. We do not know exactly the contents of that private conversation, but we do know, talking to a variety of Democrats in a news story just posted moments ago, Isaac Devera and I talked to many Democrats who are looking to Pelosi and Obama to sort of find a way out of this infighting and crisis that has dominated the